Fort Bragg is known for the heroes within it that trained there, that deployed from there, and it's an insult to say to the men and women who left there the last thing they saw on American soil before going overseas, and in some cases losing their lives, to tell them that what they left was inherently a racist institution because of a name. That's unacceptable to the president, and rightfully so. And I would also note, where do you draw the line here? I'm told that no longer can you find on HBO Gone with the Wind because somehow that is now offensive. Where do you draw the line? Should George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison be erased from history?
That's White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany explaining President Trump's opposition to calls from some to rename military bases named for Confederate generals. It's a position that runs counter to some top military leaders, including the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army, who both said they are open to a bipartisan discussion of renaming those bases. Also, former U.S. Army General and CIA Director David Petraeus wrote in a new op-ed for The Atlantic magazine, quote, "It's time to remove the names of traitors like Benning and Bragg from our country's most important military installations." The Lincoln Project, a group of conservatives critical of President Trump, took on this issue in a new ad.
The men who followed this flag 150 years ago knew what it meant. Treason against their country, the death of the United States. America defeated the men who followed that flag. Those with honor surrendered and cast it aside forever. So why does it keep showing up today at events supporting Donald Trump? And why does he call the folks who carry it very fine people?
I think there's blame on both sides, but you also had people that were very fine people.
What does it say that they're all in for Trump? What does it say that he won't condemn a flag of hate, division, and losers? For us, it says this is a time for choosing America or Trump.
Joining us now, one of the strategists behind the Lincoln Project, Steve Schmidt, and USA Today opinion columnist and former senior advisor for the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Curt Mardela. He is a Morning Joe contributor. Steve, I want to begin with you. NASCAR announced yesterday that the Confederate flag is no longer welcome at its events. It wants to send a message of inclusivity. Also, we saw just last night a statue along Memorial Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, toppled. This came after last week the governor, Ralph Northam, announced that the statue on that same boulevard of Robert E. Lee will be taken down. There is a movement away from the Confederacy at long last in the eyes of many Americans, but President Trump seems to be one of the few holdouts.
Indeed, he does, Willie, and we have a fundamental choice in November. It is America or Trump. When we look at the divisions and Trump's incitement of those divisions over these last months, in order for us to move forward as a more just society, it's finally time for this country to put down that flag of treason. And that's exactly what it was. It was a flag for a slave nation and autocracy on North American shores that was thankfully defeated at great cost, more than 620,000 American lives lost. And that flag has become a painful symbol of racism, of division, for so many in this country, and it has no place in American life. It's a racist symbol. And the president, in doing his first public rally on June 19th, Juneteenth, and doing it in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is deliberate, it's purposeful, it's provocative. Tulsa is one of the worst race massacres in American history, and June 19th, of course, is the day when word finally reached Texas and that part of the country that slavery had been abolished. And so just terrible to see Trump do that with his rally coming up in a few weeks.
So, Steve, let's talk about the history, not only of the Confederate flag, but also the history of Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee. I can tell you, as you know, I was born in Georgia, moved to Mississippi, lived in Northwest Florida, lived in upstate for a little bit. But, I grew up, the Confederate flag was everywhere. In Mississippi at Ole Miss games, they would be waving the Confederate flag. That eventually, they eventually got rid of that. In Alabama, people had Confederate flags up in the 80s. White people, including myself, didn't think much of it. Robert E. Lee was revered. If you look at Ken Burns' series on the Civil War, you can see a lot of preeminent historians revering Robert E. Lee. West Point, you always heard that Robert E. Lee's tactics were used. I talked to Stan McChrystal. I don't think he's a Southerner, who's talking about how, as a general, he revered Robert E. Lee's tactics, military tactics, and studied them, but said, of course, looking back, that was a mistake. And talk about over time, as you've seen it, the growing awareness, far too late, even for people like me, but the growing awareness of exactly what that flag symbolizes to Black Americans. And I think we need to acknowledge it's taken, I'd say, people like me. It's taken people across the South, white people across the South, who thought of themselves as being progressive. It's taken us far too long to look upon people like Robert E. Lee and look upon the symbol of the Confederate flag the way that we have looked upon it over the past 10, 15 years.
Well, a couple of things, Joe. Good morning. In Germany, where the swastika is banned, neo-Nazis carry the Confederate flag when they march. It's become a symbol of racism. Now, if you go back in American history to 1865, when the war won, and you read Lincoln's second inaugural, he had no higher ambition than to put the country back together. And putting the country back together came at a price. And that price was absolution by the North for the Southern cause. The myth that it was somehow noble, that it wasn't about slavery, that the country didn't become like the Balkans, where we had generations fighting each other in guerrilla war. And the reason for that literally began the day of the surrender, when Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the great hero of Gettysburg, a major general in the Army, wounded 8 times, was given the honor by Grant of accepting the Confederate surrender. And as the Confederate Army marched by, Chamberlain called the Union Army to attention, presented arms, and played Dixie. And that move was celebrated throughout the country as a symbol of healing. But the problem was, with all of it, was the endemic racism that was part of the Confederacy. And when we look at the Lincoln assassination and then Reconstruction and the racial terror that played out in the South during those decades after the Civil War, we have to understand today that many of those Confederate monuments were put up in the 1920s. They were a political statement after the First World War, when blacks who fought valorously thought they might come home to a country where they would be more free. And so we have indulged this myth of honor around the Confederacy until today, until 2020. And now it's enough is enough. It's to recognize this for what it is a symbol of slavery and racism that causes great pain to a lot of our fellow Americans.
And Kurt, and Kurt, I didn't know until the controversies really started cropping up in a dramatic way, that also that Confederate flag in many cases wasn't even used until the civil rights era started to really, civil rights leaders started to assert themselves in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, that people started adopting that more. Again, just like Donald Trump, as symbolism against civil rights. We lost audio from Curt. We'll try to get back to him. Aaron, let's talk about that and talk about how the Confederate flag was used really as a symbolic resistance to civil rights advances for Black Americans in the late 50s and the 1960s, and also how Donald Trump is once again using it symbolically to provoke a culture war.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly the point, Joe. We have seen, and I think that several of us, covering this president and this administration assumed that the president would be returning to a racial playbook headed into the 2020 election. But now the difference is that he is doing that amid a national reckoning on race, at the center of which is an indictment of institutional racism, which means that no institutions are immune. And that includes these Confederate statues, which, I think in recent years, Charlottesville, the Charleston massacre, we've talked about what to do with these Confederate statues. But again, the time for talk is over for a lot of people. You're seeing people taking these statues down and taking these symbols down across the country, even as the president is kind of continuing to embrace maintaining these Confederate statues. Listen, this president has openly questioned the cause of the Civil War, right? Saying that slavery may not have even been the reason. And so, I think that is a message, as Steve Schmidt points out in that ad, that may be at odds with an America that is kind of coming to the realization that this is not who we are, but is this who we want to be? That is the question that so many people are having going into this fall.
Erin Haynes, thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it. Love having you. Steve Schmidt, same as well. Curt Mardela, we'll have you tomorrow. We'll make sure the sound works, but it was great just seeing your face. That does it for us this morning. We appreciate all of you watching the show during these historic times. Stephanie Ruhle picks up the coverage right now. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.